Dr. Baker, it really came together for me with my mom in 2021. She was on 6 medications, the statin, the metformin. She was obese, high blood pressure, told by her doctors, no problem. These are normal rites of passage for an American. But then that led to an abrupt diagnosis of pancreatic cancer. She died 12 days later. I asked him at first point blank whether Lucky Charms, the grains in Lucky Charms, were the same, as he argues, nutritionally as organic quinoa. And he said yes. He said, actually, it might be better because they're fortified using this great scientific technique. As 80% of the country has become obese or overweight in just the past generation, and 60% of adults by some measures have prediabetes or diabetes, we're being told to stay the course.
This morning we have with us a special guest, Calley Means. Calley, welcome. I just wanted to ask where you're located.
I'm one of the many that bailed California during COVID and moved to Scottsdale, Arizona. And I'm actually making the full freedom trail and moving to Austin, Texas soon. But I got out of California recently.
I likewise left California in 2021 as well, and some but I'm in Washington State, so maybe I'm really not much of a lateral move than anything else. But I'll be in Austin later this month. So, Calley, I guess I've been following you on Twitter, or I guess it's now called X, for at least 6 months, maybe longer, and I've been very interested in some of the stuff you've been talking about because it aligns a lot of what stuff I've been sort of noticing. And I guess just for the folks that aren't aware of your background, would you share kind of your history a little bit, if you don't mind?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I was born and raised actually in Washington, D.C. in the swamp. And my dad worked in politics in the 70s and indoctrinated in that, and went to Stanford with the goal of getting back to D.C. and working in politics. And that's what I did, worked in campaigns. And then right after the campaigns ended, I learned a lesson that many people learn in D.C. And you're inevitably, both parties are across the table from two industries and working for two industries, the two biggest spenders in Washington, D.C., which are food companies and the pharma companies. And the pharma spends 5 times more than the oil industry on lobbying and public affairs, and the food industry is not too behind it. So worked for Coca-Cola, worked for the opioid makers, statin makers, and had some interesting experiences. Basically, with the benefit of hindsight, saw that food companies are really trying to make food cheap and addictive. And in a way, that makes sense. That's their interests. But the healthcare industry doesn't stand up to that. They're profiting and actually, in many ways, partnering with the food companies to increase this chronic disease crisis that we see. And that's how 95% of the healthcare industry makes money. 95% of dollars in the healthcare industry is managing food-based illnesses. So I was actually shocked how literally in one day we working for Coca-Cola actually funneling money to the American Diabetes Association, to the American Pediatrics Association. So you actually have literally in one meeting, we're working on paying from food company money to medical groups. And in the second meeting, we're talking to medical groups about profiting from the chronic disease crisis. So got out of politics, became an entrepreneur. Yeah, Dr. Baker, it really came together for me with my mom in 2021. She was on 6 medications, the statin, the metformin. She was obese, high blood pressure, told by her doctors for 40 years, no problem. These are normal rites of passage for an American patient. But then that led to an abrupt diagnosis of pancreatic cancer. She died 12 days later. So that's an American story where there's all these comorbidities happening to all of us. Infertility is skyrocketing. That's a foodborne illness. PCOS, which many women are facing, is insulin resistance. It literally is a foodborne illness. COVID, we were lied to that was essentially a foodborne illness. If you were metabolically healthy, you weren't dying of COVID. So all of these things that are medicalized and siloed, that's a lie. So that was my mom. And then my sister, who was the star of the family, a physician, a surgeon, right before that had left the system, seeing this corruption. That inspired me too. So that's my mission, Dr. Baker. I'm just working to call out what I saw and working to change the incentives because we're really being lied to.
You know, when you look at the situation, that makes sense. It's just almost intentional. How could a population get so sick so rapidly accidentally? It's almost if it's, yes, I get it. And I think the day-to-day physician probably is somewhat oblivious to this. It probably goes at the very higher levels. And as you correctly point out, pharma has the biggest lobbying dollars. You can look at the lot. It's widely available, that data, but that's probably just what's available. There's probably stuff that goes under the table, I'm sure, that's not reported, that it's probably more insidious than even that. It's my guess. Now, do you find that one of the things that's a real issue here is with government, we have these agencies, whether it's USDA or the FDA, that are largely, they've undergone corporate capture. We see that. Is that the same thing in the food industry? Do you have pretty good evidence that USDA is, because that's really the food regulators. Is the USDA pretty much captured as well?
Your question sets it up perfectly. The biggest under the table covert lobbying is through research grants. It's all about the research grants. So I was, again, a person just out of college, junior person. I was shocked working for the American Beverage Association, working for large food companies, consulting, lobbying for them. In the offices in DC, we had printouts and lists of professors. I'm like, why do we have all these lists of Harvard professors and Tufts University professors and professors overseas at Oxford? It was a donation strategy. So the food industry gives 11 times more money to fund nutritional research than the NIH. So the backbone of nutrition research is food company dollars, is ultra-processed food company dollars. And this is the key thing for folks to understand. In the past 2 years, there was 50,000 peer-reviewed nutrition studies. Now, humans are the only animals that are systematically obese, diabetic, have cardiovascular issues, or frankly, the only animal studied that's chronically depressed. The only difference we have to animals in the wild is that we have these peer-reviewed studies, these experts telling us that ultra-processed food is good. And putting the pieces together, I'll say this. A nutrition study is a PR document for ultra-processed food. The point of nutrition research is to convince us that pasture-raised meat is bad, but Cheerios are okay, which the NIH and Tufts University recently said. The whole point that there's not a broccoli lobby, there's not a pasture-raised meat lobby, there's not that's anywhere near as big. So that's what I learned. Every single nutrition study that you hear about in the news, I almost guarantee you there's money tied to that from processed food interests. Because why would we need to convince humans that natural food, that's what these studies do. They convince us that natural food might not be the best option, that meat might be dangerous. That's the big takeaway there. And where the money flows to, you mentioned the USDA, these agencies don't have bureaucrats inside the agencies make the guidelines. You have to understand the USDA nutrition guidelines, for example, or at the FDA, obesity standard of care recommendations. Let's take those one by one. At the USDA, it's an outside group making the nutrition recommendations. It's outside experts. It's the dean of Tufts Nutrition School, right? And a Harvard professor, people like that. 95% of them in the most recent nutrition studies were paid for by food or pharma companies. So this isn't complicated. What we're able to do, and what I saw back in the day, is you funnel money to the people that are going to be put on the panels. So when you have 95% of the USDA nutrition panel directly paid by ultra-processed food companies and or pharma companies, what do you get? You get literally to this day, the USDA saying that a 2-year-old, that 10% of their diet can be added sugar. You still have an attack on meat in many ways. So that's what you get on the USDA side. And just real quick on the FDA side, I mentioned the opioids. When I was back in 2011, around that period, it was all about the opioids. And we funneled millions of dollars in research grants and consulting payments to professors that studied pain, and they were appointed to the NIH panel to give opioid guidance. So 90% of that panel was directly paid by opioid makers, and they had to relax standards, and that's really led to the opioid crisis. Just in the past couple of years, obesity has been all the talk, the medicalization of obesity. The panels that are pushing Ozempic as the standard of care, not healthier eating, those panels are almost unanimously physicians that are directly paid through research grants, which is the lifeblood of their industry, and direct consulting payments, bribes, by the makers of Ozempic and the other anti-obesity drugs. So that's how it works. That's where the covert money flows hands. It's all about the academic spending.
Yeah, I've certainly witnessed that. And the whole Ozempic topic's interesting to touch on. We should maybe explore that a little bit. When you say that, like you mentioned, Tufts University, Darius Mozaffarian saying that I think it was a food compass guide, but we recently saw a study USDA put out, 91% processed food diet can be healthy. And it's just almost as like they're really pushing these ultra processed foods. Why is it just because they're so much more profitable, or what is the incentive to do that versus broccoli or beef or more what we would consider unprocessed foods?
I asked Darius, the former dean of Tufts Nutrition School, arguably the most prominent nutrition scientist in the country. So after I shared some information about the Food Compass, went on Fox News, kind of talked about this, Joe Rogan retweeted something that my partner and I put together. He actually called me. He got my number and called me. You can't even make this up, but from a breakout session at Davos. He was at Davos on panels talking about reducing meat consumption and cows being the biggest part of global warming. He took a break from that session, called me screaming, very angry. And I asked him some of these simple questions. I asked him at first point blank whether Lucky Charms, the grains in Lucky Charms were the same, as he argues, nutritionally as organic quinoa. And he said yes. He said actually it might be better, that the grains in Lucky Charms might actually be better because they're fortified using this great scientific technique. So he actually very angrily questioning my credentials actually said I had no idea what I'm talking about, saying that the grains in Lucky Charms are in any way worse than quinoa. So that was number one. Number two, I just said, sir, you've obviously dedicated to this cause. You've published hundreds of research, but every study you've published has been funded essentially by ultra-processed food. Your school is totally funded by ultra-processed food. And he also, it's publicly available, not just research grants, takes direct payments. He takes direct payments from a lead prescriber of Ozempic. He's on their advisory board and gets monthly payments. And he's taken direct payments from ultra-processed food companies. And I just asked him a simple question, does that impact your judgment? And I was subject to another 5-minute harangue about how I am just an idiot for thinking and questioning his integrity, that him getting millions of dollars to these companies would in any way impact the research. The reason ultra-processed food companies, and I'll just tell you from being in the room with them, again, they spend 11 times more nutritional research than the NIH, hundreds of billions of dollars over the past 10 years. I can tell you, sitting with these Coca-Cola executives, they're not contributing this hundreds of millions of dollars out of a dispassionate interest in advancing nutritional scholarship. Companies actually are illegally able to spend hundreds of billions of dollars when you really add it all, hundreds of millions of dollars, if it's not in their fiduciary interest. So they expect a return on the investment. And the reason nutrition research funding is going up from food companies is because they're getting it. So yeah, back to your point, ultra-processed food is significantly more profitable as it stands today than natural food. It's shelf stable. The ingredients are heavily subsidized because of the rig system. Of course, this gets to the devil's bargain with pharma. The costs downstream of that are going to bankrupt the country. Something I've talked about a lot with Coca-Cola is we lobbied aggressively to keep food stamp funding flowing to sugary drinks. Food stamps funding is sugary drinks are the number one item on food stamps, 10%, $10 billion a year go from the federal treasury to soda companies from the food stamp program. Now that's why, and a reason why ultra-processed food is profitable. It's heavily subsidized. It's addictive. That food stamp funding, I believe, is the most suicidal public policy we have, because we're literally throwing addictive, deadly substances into lower income kids' hands that is then causing, and you can directly map this out, trillions of dollars of downstream health impacts that the U.S. taxpayer has to fund, which is literally bankrupting the country. The healthcare industry is the largest and the fastest growing industry in the country because they make money treating chronic conditions that aren't getting better. So we're 20% of GDP growing at an increasing rate. It's going to be 40% in 15 years. Literally going to destroy our country. That's going to be the top reason the American experiment fails, is because we got fatter, sicker, more depressed at an increasing rate while doing nothing about it. So what we're doing is suicidal. But yeah, the ultra processed food companies that's profitable, and that's what they're trying to keep in place.
Yeah, I see a number of physicians out there, which kind of, I shake my head at it, talking about that ultra processed foods are the future. We're not going to get rid of them. And the best we can do is make quote unquote healthy processed foods. Do you see because my thought is the whole reason they're making ultra processed foods so that they're addictive, because they want you to spend money on that. And so I don't see there's a great incentive to make them healthy so you may not overeat them or something like that. What are your thoughts on that? Because I've seen several physicians promoting ultra processed foods and they're talking, they're not that bad. They're protein powder and things like that. But do you see, is that more of this just messaging that's going out through these different intermediaries, these physicians that have been maybe even bought and paid for? Who knows?
Yeah. Even if they're not bought and paid for, which many are, in the psychology profession, Harvard was recently trying to do a study of psychologists. They literally couldn't find a speaker who wasn't paid by SRI makers. If you're holding an obesity conference right now of obesity doctors, you'd be hard pressed to find a doctor that hasn't been paid by Novo Nordisk, the maker of Ozempic. In 2021, the last year we have data, 420,000 individual payments went from Novo Nordisk to doctors in the United States. 420 individual payments. So they are being directly paid off. I push you on one thing, Shawn. You mentioned the doctors, most of them are good. I agree. Many people, my family are doctors, many of my best friends are doctors. I do increasingly put some culpability on them because I think every doctor, if they're using any critical thinking, knows that they're engaged in a system that is not making patients better. The suicide rate of doctors is the highest among any profession, as you probably know. And the New York Times recently read an article, and they talk about the mental health crisis among doctors, and they actually compared the phenomenon to soldiers who were forced to commit war crimes. And then it's actually this unique psychological thing where you actually get into the war for the right reasons and then they get completely disenfranchised. I do actually think that's happening to doctors at scale. And I do put some culpability, for instance, on pediatricians. How can pediatricians look at the American Academy of Pediatrics guidelines to tell kids, which they're required to do, by the way, that the first thing they should eat is highly processed grains as puffs? That's literally on a sheet that they're required to give to parents, saying that they should, basically, the kids should only have ultra processed food as their first, very much steering them away from chewing on a piece of steak or eating whole natural food. I do think it's culpable on the doctors in some of these things, as we're seeing an absolute devastating growth in chronic diseases, particularly among kids who are not speaking out. So yeah, I think there's some culpability on the doctors, why they get and become spokespeople for ultra processed food. This is how I look at it. It just is a high level systemic perspective. Incentives describe everything, right? So if you have a cardiologist, if you have an obesity doctor, if you have a doctor who treats diabetes, they will be out of a job if people learn metabolically healthy habits. They will be out of a job if people stop eating ultra processed food and listen to you. They are good people. I was actually speaking recently, and a lot of doctors come up to me and commiserate and talk to me about what they're seeing. An obesity doctor at Harvard said to me recently that if she could snap her fingers and cure childhood obesity, she would. That's why she got in the profession. But she said the bottom line is that we just hired 15 new doctors for our new obesity center. We have a loan to build that center that's underwritten by estimates for increasing obesity patients, and that they're going to be lifetime patients because we're prescribing them drugs that need to be managed for life. That's the underpinning of the industry. There will be massive economic disruption. People will be out of jobs if people stop getting sicker. So the incentives there have made the medical profession unwittingly proponents for things that are obviously untrue. As 80% of the country has become obese or overweight in just the past generation, and 60% of adults by some measures have prediabetes or diabetes, we're being told to stay the course. We're being told to eat more ultra-processed food. So it's insane. I do put culpability on the doctors, honestly, because it's just manifestly wrong. And it's frankly evil given what's happening to the American people. But it's explained by the incentives.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all. What is there? How much of we see a board of directors of like pharmaceutical companies sitting on major media outlets? And that's I think pretty well known. Do we see some crosstalk between like big food and big pharma? Are there relationships behind the scenes? Are there board members that sit on both companies? Do we know anything about that?
Yeah, so I was surprised to see more connections than I ever expected. So I'll just go into, I think, something I briefly mentioned, but I think it's very instructive. Is Coke during my time was highly involved with the American Diabetes Association. So let's back up. Diabetes type 2 has absolutely skyrocketed. The most shocking statistic I think there is that 33% of young adults now have prediabetes. That used to be just unthinkable to see a child with any type of like metabolic dysfunction like that a generation ago. And if you were to identify, and I don't think there's much medical disagreement about that, if you were to identify one trend that has risen to the explosion of diabetes, it's the weapon of mass destruction for blood sugar regulation, which is liquid sugar. This is essentially a new phenomenon that people up until about 8 years ago never even saw. You might have sweets and fresh juice sometimes, but this is very rare. So a Coca-Cola, a 20 ounce, a kid drinking that today, that's as much sugar as an average child 150 years ago got in a year. So and it's liquid form. It's fructose, which is particularly weaponized for various reasons. It's going straight to that child's bloodstream in a very fast delivery mechanism. So if there's anything the American Diabetes Association should be doing, it should be calling out this explosion of addictive sugary drinks. They took money from Coke. They literally on their website said that small cans of Coke might be a good choice for diabetics. At Coke, working for the American Beverage Association, a massive agenda item was working and partnering and sponsoring hospitals. That's why you see people from Coke, people from other companies on hospital boards, because often food companies are one of the biggest donators to hospitals. And it's why, and this is very purposeful, if you go to any pediatric hospital, you will see very prominently ultra-processed food machines and Coke machines. I just posted on my Instagram, I was recently at Stanford Med School working with a couple of professors that are actually doing the right thing. You can't even make this up. I've never seen anything like it. In the entrance to where students go to class, it's like almost blocked by a massive Coke machine. That is like people going to a rehab clinic and having a big heroin machine. They are literally going in there to study why their hospitals are full with patients with metabolic disorders. That's 85% of deaths in the United States. It's 85% of medical costs. They have a classroom building with Coke machines flanking both entrances, 300 feet from a gleaming new hospital that cost $400 million to build, that is overflowing with people who are experiencing preventable foodborne illnesses. So that's actually by design. It was a massive goal to normalize this food that's poisoning us. So again, getting the Coke machines in hospitals, getting the sponsorship of hospitals, sponsorship of medical groups, and then of course schools. 80% of schools in the United States to this day still have a machine selling sugary drinks.
I interviewed a kid the other day. I call him a kid, he's 40, but he was, at 16 years of age, he was 600 pounds. No, at 14 years of age, right. 600 pounds. And his drug of choice was basically Coca-Cola. That allowed him to get to that size, which I thought was just shocking to see someone like that. Why, if we know, I don't think anyone out there, even every physician probably realizes that Coca-Cola and beverages similar to that are problematic. Why can't we do anything about it? What's preventing it? What's preventing that? Obviously, they're a multi-billion-dollar company, and they probably, I suspect they've got a lot of politicians in their back pocket. But what is the reason we can't really do something about this?
A couple of thoughts there. I do think actually the fact that we're having maybe this somewhat depressing conversation, I actually want to just say I don't think it's depressing. I think there is a bottoms up revolution happening of people following you, everyone from Joe Rogan on down, from podcasts on many different topics. Their critical thinkers are getting to this foundational point that we're being poisoned, and that actually breaking free of the incentives of our systems, that there's nothing more profitable than a person being in fear, being addicted, being frankly sick, and being depressed. That's a very profitable person for the system as long as they don't die. But I think a lot of people are breaking free of that, and there is a bottoms up revolution. I'm actually optimistic things are going to change, because mathematically they have to. Mathematically, what's happening actually, we're unsustainable. We're literally on the road to becoming a bankrupt, infertile population that's increasingly depressed, suicidal, and fat and sick. So I actually think it has to change. But why it's so normalized, why this is all happening now, you mentioned it earlier. I think we talk about food in the wrong way. I think we have the world's largest addiction crisis with food. I think it's akin to companies it might be easier to think about like heroin and sneaking it into food, starting with kids at 6 months old, but an item that we actually are required to eat to survive. That's what's happened. The regulatory agencies, through financial conflicts, have been asleep at the wheel. They've been asleep as we've absolutely bastardized our food system. That's like literally the makeup of our bodies. And these companies have been able to put very addictive and harmful substances in our food. And all you have to do, if you question whether food is addictive, is look at a birthday party of 3-year-olds and look what happens if they're not given sugar. They have a mental breakdown, literally a mental breakdown. And then look what happens when they all get the sugar and the candy that the parents have to give them to placate them. They look like literally like habit-seeking meth addicts, which they essentially are from a neuro scanning perspective. If you scan their brains, their dopamine and their reward centers are exactly the same. So that's what I think we have. You mentioned that person. I don't think Americans have gotten systematically lazier in the past 50 years. I don't think Americans have gotten systematically more suicidal and lazier in the past 50 years, which is what we're being told to believe, right? We're being told that we're going so against our evolutionary instincts, and Americans are so lazy that obesity has skyrocketed, that people want to be 300, 400 pounds at scale, that fathers are trying to miss walking their daughters down the aisle, which is happening increasingly because life expectancy is going down, that this bursting of if you have diabetes, if you have heart disease, that really negatively impacts your life. People don't want this. So you either assume that people are just absolutely suicidal or lazy, or you have to look to the fact that there's a highly powerful addictive chemicals that somehow have been put in our food, and put in our food, frankly, uniquely in America. I think we've exported this Western diet, this American diet throughout the world, but it is orders of magnitude better in some European countries and Japan who really take this stuff seriously. So there's a unique thing happening. And I think it gets to addiction. And the last thing I'll say, working for the food companies, is they know this. Assume, I don't know, I used to think this, right? Companies have our best interests at heart. Philip Morris was one of the 10 largest companies in the world in the 1980s. You look at the top companies. Cigarette smoking was much more prominent. And as the cigarette companies declined, they actually bought food companies and they shifted all the scientists to food companies exactly at the time the food pyramid was in the 1990s, was encouraging more ultra processed food. So everyone needs to understand there are thousands of the most highly trained, smartest scientists in the world working to make food addictive. And that's what's happened.
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually had someone that approached me that was one of those people that was a chemical engineer working for food companies. And she said her job was basically to make food addictive. And she had a lot of regret about it and wanted to redeem herself by maybe helping us with what we're doing. But I was just in Germany a couple of days ago, and I noticed distinctly less obese people there. And I know that in Europe, a lot of the foods ingredients that are in foods here in the United States are banned in Europe. Why is it we accept them in the United States? What's wrong with the USDA, which will allow this stuff? And we have this sort of thing called generally recognized as safe designation. Why has Europe got such a different standard, or even Japan, as you mentioned, than the United States? And what is allowing us to accept these potentially harmful ingredients?
Yeah, it's not hard to rig the American political conversation. And I was duped too, right? I grew up and worked in Republican politics, was conservative. And until I really put these pieces together, I thought it was representation of the nanny state, right? And this is what I did with food companies for any discussion of regulation on ingredients, right? It's the nanny state. We can't have that. The food industry in the US is feeding the world, is innovating, and we're not going to be like Europe to put restrictions. And that's the arguments we gave, and that's what we paid money and paid a lot of people to say. I was completely wrong on that. And I think friends on the conservative side of the aisle, I think, still make this mistake. It's not an attack on the free market to question why food companies are able to put 3,000 neurotoxins into our food that are not legal in any other country in the world. It is actually a corruption of the free market that food companies are able to completely buy off regulatory agencies and enable those companies to load our foods with neurotoxins. To this day, right, we have, as you said, thousands of toxic ingredients are allowed that aren't allowed in any other country in the world. And it's literally the regulations are self-policing and self-reporting. These food companies aren't even inspected. The top one, of course, is glyphosate, which has been completely strong-armed. It's just been a totally vicious loop because our monocropping system has led to our crops to get totally poisoned, and the lack of biodiversity leads to the need for fertilizer, which then we need to create seeds to protect it from the glyphosate. It's just crazy, right? It's this vicious cycle by its own making. So yeah, it is corruption, and it's a perversion of political arguments. You have on the left, what's happening is through this corrupt system, we've made it that it's almost like people are attacked for questioning what people are eating because it's like they're poor, they can only afford that toxic food. It's elitist to talk about or question what lower income people, at least they're getting something. Like that's a big argument, and that's actually funded, right? We actually funded left-wing groups to say you're being fat phobic, you're being elitist for questioning what people are eating. So that's a box too, right? Because we've created this system where it's been normalized to eat poison, which is costing us trillions of dollars of downstream health effects. And then the Washington Post just came out with a story. Food companies fund TikTok influencers now, nutritionists, millions of dollars to actually jump on anybody who's questioning ultra-processed food from a racial justice and anti-fat phobic and gender discrimination, all the angles saying that it's wrong to shame somebody for what they eat, especially if it's all they can afford. Again, that's a perversion of the market because we only have this situation where people are eating poison because of the incentives in place. That's the contribution I'm trying to make, and what my 20-year, what I hope to see is that at a foundational level, just from any logic of constructing a society, of keeping people healthy, of spending the $4 trillion we spend right now on healthcare, food is central to our health. It's so simple, but that is not understood by the medical system. And if you're spending an amount of money on the health of a population, you have to start with what we're putting in our bodies. That is what Europe and Japan do. So France spends almost double what we do per capita in food and half what we do in healthcare. So we have to get that trade-off a little better. And frankly, my dream, and I think what we have to eventually get to, is instead of subsidizing Coke and ultra-processed food, which 90% of agriculture subsidies go to ultra-processed food, a Coke is cheaper than water when you go to most stores because they have so many subsidized ingredients. We need to facilitate regenerative farming. We need to facilitate like soil health. We need to facilitate actually an ecosystem that produces non-poisonous food, not double down on ultra-processed food, which many argue.
Yeah, I want to go back to Ozempic because that's and other GLP-1 agonists that are coming on. And another one just came on. It's even more powerful, so to speak. And we see that people are lobbying for our tax dollars to fund that so that there's no sort of socioeconomic injustice, so we could racial injustice and so on and so forth. And one of the things that's a problem in itself that we're going to be paying for, just perpetuating the cycle and just, putting the expensive medical band-aids on it. But the other thing is, I saw the response from a lot of the processed foods companies saying, because people say, are you worried that this is going to affect your bottom line because people are being not eating as much? And they said, we're going to adapt our processed foods so that we can continue to sell this stuff. So maybe you can comment on those topics.
Yeah. So there's a company called Revero, and it's one of the biggest pill mills, these online pill mills that prescribe Viagra, where you can take a couple of questions and get a prescription for Viagra. And the company's really struggling, and they decided to really double down on Ozempic. And I think they're struggling with that because it's not government subsidized yet, but they really need it to be because they're burning a lot of cash. So the CEO recently posted an 8,000-word diatribe dressed in kind of intellectual language, literally arguing that the largest social justice and medical inequality issue we face is not having the government pay for Ozempic for lower income folks. And I actually got emotional reading this. I have many mutual friends with this guy. I feel for him because his company's suffering and he's really trying to get this approval, this $15,000 a year subsidy from the government to his company. And they're putting up ads all around New York advertising this to millennials. That's what they're trying to do. But I got emotional because just think about a kid in this country, right? they are being assaulted. They're eating food that has thousands of neurotoxins and that has loaded with glyphosate. They're being told by the NIH that Lucky Charms are better than eggs and beef. They have a weapon of mass destruction of chronic stress in their pockets with their phone. They are exponentially moving less than they did a generation ago. Only 20% of 21-year-olds are eligible to join the military for fitness. So kids on almost every level are being absolutely crushed by corporate interests. And instead of asking why 25% of kids have fatty liver disease, what we're doing to these children societally that's leading to this everything going up all at once, to the fact that 40% of high school seniors have a mental health disorder, and the second leading cause of death for young adults is suicide. This is all connected. And you're telling me that we need to take $15,000 per year per person and start injecting children at 12 years old, which is what the standards are right now, with this injectable for their entire lives, instead of asking with that $15,000 a year per person, how we can increase regenerative farming to get these kids better food, how we can teach these kids better meditation habits and mental health habits to actually get through life better instead of just constantly being chronically stressed, metabolic habits. So that's, to me, where the Ozempic thing is really, I think, one of the largest issues in the country, because this will be the most expensive drug in American history. That's why the stock is so high. It's the most valuable company in Europe right now on expectations of US government approval. They don't prescribe Ozempic for obesity or government fund it in Denmark, where the company's based. This is not the standard of care in Europe. The company makes very little revenue in Europe, their home country. It's all about convincing the US regulators, really, that the massive increase in obesity is because of Ozempic deficiency. And they're funding professors, right, in the exact same playbook I talked about and I saw. They're funding professors, Fatima Cody, Stanford, at Harvard, I think we probably have both seen, literally saying that obesity is not the cause of what we eat or lifestyle or movement. She said, quote, "Throw that out the window. It's a brain disease and it's genetic." A Harvard professor said this with a straight face on 60 Minutes. This is what we're being asked to believe. It's a game being played. And this guy at Roe and these executives who are really, let's just call it a spade, trying to force injections or really push injections on a material percentage of U.S. children. I think high level it's evil. I think it's just manifestly the wrong way to address the not just obesity, but the rise of just all chronic and metabolic conditions. And the last thing I'll say there, just on the Ozempic thing, is it is based on a lie. It's based on a lie that obesity is the root cause of the problem. Obesity is one branch of the tree of metabolic dysfunction. The problem is that our cells are malfunctioning because of what we're eating, because of being sedentary, because of sleep, because of these basic things, chronic stress, sunlight, circadian rhythm. It's these basic things that are totally out of whack. That's causing metabolic dysfunction, and that's leading to the rise of everything: autoimmune conditions, heart disease, cancer, diabetes, obesity. If we solve that the root of the tree, which should be the top goal of U.S. public policy, because we're becoming a non-competitive population, we transform the country if we prioritize that. So that's where the Ozempic debate, I think, if some rich celebrity in Hollywood wants to, I'm a libertarian. Drugs should be legal. We shouldn't governments fund them.
Yeah, I did see that Dr. Stanford discussion, and I was blown away that you have a physician saying that it doesn't matter what you eat, it doesn't matter how much you exercise, you're still going to be obese. And that, to me, that's where it is. We've got physicians. I have gastroenterologists who'll tell me that things like Crohn's disease have nothing to do with diet,
right.
And I'm like, literally, it's everything to do with diet in my view. But that's where we are. And you mentioned we have this groundswell, which is, I think, really what it's going to take. I don't see the head of the USDA suddenly saying ultra-processed foods are bad, we need to get away from them. And if anything, they seem to be embracing that in a greater and greater frequency. Do you see, you said you're hopeful, and I am too, but do you see anything outside of this, just millions of people saying we're tired of this crap? And are there some signals from maybe people that have maybe some influence, maybe some politicians that sort of maybe get it? Is there any evidence that that's going on?
I've been going to DC a lot, going back to my roots, meeting with a lot of members of Congress. And I will say that the highest level, and whatever you think of these two folks on opposite sides of the aisle, but the two people driving the conversation in the presidential election right now are RFK and Donald Trump. RFK is polling higher for an independent candidate than any candidate in the past 100 years. Ross Perot, his max was 19%, and he won about 19% of the vote. RFK's at 26%. He's the most popular politician in America among women and independents. His entire message is about this. His entire message is literally what we're talking about, and about dismantling the regulatory agencies. That there's something visceral that's resonating with the American people about why they and their kids are getting so much sicker, and we're being told to trust the science, trust the system that's making us so sick. I'd also say President Trump, if you go on his Instagram, is literally saying that day one, he wants to put a panel together and ask why the hell kids are getting so sick and why we're being poisoned by our environment and our food. And he's talking a lot about that in a very similar way to RFK. So I do actually think some of the highest polling, whatever you think of them, some of the highest polling people on the national stage. And I do think it's going to be a national, because it gets so complicated with the state by state, district by district issues. There needs to be national leadership really saying we need to step back and ask what the hell is going on. We need to step back and ask whether it's right for healthcare to be the largest and fastest growing industry in the country, when every single institution in that industry, from med schools to insurance companies to pharma companies to hospitals, make more money when people are sick and lose money when people are healthy. That is the wrong incentive for the most powerful and largest industry in the country. And I think it is a very powerful national message to say, we're going to stop this immediately. So I'm relatively optimistic there. What I'm involved in, and what I'm seeing more people and entrepreneurs and folks on the outside do, is I think it all boils down to chipping away at incentives. So I actually was inspired by some friends with Crohn's disease and other autoimmune conditions who were being sent to the hospital for like weekly injections for the rest of their life, which makes everybody money. It makes the hospital money. It makes pharma money, and who transformed their lives by going to functional medicine doctors and basically getting on a food prescription. I routinely heard from people with autoimmune conditions who actually got outside the medical system that getting the autoimmune condition was one of the most positive elements of their life, because it put them on this journey to discover how to really cure their bodies and eat food. So I started a company called TrueMed, which it actually turns out if you have a doctor's note for food and for exercise, for pasture-raised meat, for CrossFit, for instance, you can actually use medical tax advantage dollars. You can actually use HSA, FSA dollars. There's $150 billion in these accounts. They're generally used for drugs. You can actually use a lot of medical programs for food if you have a doctor's prescription, which is what our company TrueMed does. I actually think it's criminal. It's certainly against the Hippocratic Oath that folks that come in with autoimmune conditions, with prediabetes, with heart disease, with obesity, they're not getting a food prescription from their doctor. They're not getting a letter of medical necessity from their doctor outlining proven dietary and exercise interventions to reverse those conditions and probably every other comorbidity. So we're seeing a groundswell of support for that, and a lot of other entrepreneurs in other various ways trying to chip away at incentives. If I put ultra-processed addictive food and sugar in front of my child, they're going to eat that. It's an addictive drug. It's available. It's subsidized. We need to stop recommending these products, which we do right now. We need to stop subsidizing them, and we need to start incentivizing the right medicine, food that's good, exercise, things like that. If we can chip away at those incentives, which I think is happening, we'll get on a better trajectory.
Let me ask you, because obviously many of these companies are global. You know, Coca-Cola, obviously, I don't know how many billions of dollars they have, and they're global companies. What countries in the world do you think are actually doing a good job? There's somebody, obviously, America is wonderful. We have all kinds of tremendous advantages to being in America with our U.S. Constitution. But there are aspects of which we might say we might want to model ours. I know Italy just said, hell no to fake meat and that stuff. But I mean, do you see any places that are, because they're all subject to this global influence, are there any places that are doing a good job with their food system?
Yeah, and I'll just say on your point about America, I think the fact that we're having this conversation and the fact that there's so much outside agitation is actually the best part about our system. I think that we often get off course, but there's not people in China on the country's most popular podcast absolutely eviscerating the institutions of that country. And I actually think what's happening here with the best-selling books, the best podcasts, on this topic is actually what the founders envisioned, quite frankly. I think we will get this right if we continue talking about it, but we absolutely have lost our way, and this is an existential issue. But again, our system's designed, I think, to talk about and hopefully correct these existential threats. But yeah, I hate to give Europe too much credit, but in France, what children eat at daycare is one of the most important national priorities. It is literally like sacrosanct. At every daycare in France, there's a 4-course meal starting at 1 year old at every daycare in the country, including a cheese course. And I actually, the seriousness with what child, like just the nonpartisan, just like absolute insistence that they're eating non-poison food without glyphosate, without meat, without a bunch of hormones, food that with grass-fed milk. It's just like, it is like to the ingredient is highly. And I used to think it's ridiculous, all these type of seriousness about all the ingredients in food, but they're really serious about the ingredients. It's almost a cliche at this point, going to Italy or France and eating a bunch of carbs and losing weight. It's fundamentally because these ingredients aren't poisoned, which is a priority in their countries. Again, you're almost like made fun of for buying like meat that's not loaded with crap or organic food, or that's not loaded with like glyphosate. You're belittled in the United States here and called elitist. In France, that's actually like part of the culture. The country we should all be studying is Japan. The obesity rate is right. It's 45% plus in the United States. It's under 10. There, it is no messing around with the ingredients and with the healthcare public policy. In Japan, I think there's a lot to learn from them. And then the Nordic countries, Sweden, again, I don't like to give these folks a lot of credit. There's probably a lot they can learn from us. But they have actually a program for lower income folks where they basically are encouraged and have cards and can very seamlessly purchase whole food and only whole food, right? They're not committing national suicide by encouraging their lower income folks to buy ultra processed food and soda. That's not government subsidized. It's just natural food, which makes a lot of sense because once you're lower income and diabetic, you're inevitably just going to be on a lifetime of comorbidities. You're going to be more depressed. You're going to be less happy and less contributing members to society. They understand that and have a lot of policies around lower income nutrition subsistence in the Nordic countries that I'm taking a big look at and talking to members of Congress about.
Yeah, one of the other things, and I don't watch a lot of TV anymore, but I'm shocked by the amount of direct-to-consumer drug advertising that's on TV. And I guess the United States and New Zealand are the only countries in the world that allow that. Is there any thought that we could reverse that? It seems like a stroke of the pen, an executive order can
stroke of the pen.
Why are we not doing that? What is it? Why was that allowed in the first place?
Yeah, Disney and Nickelodeon, Viacom are aggressively lobbied the FTC to be one of the only countries in the world to aggressively market. You turn on Nickelodeon, the Disney Channel, it's only processed food ads, and that's from lobbying. And then there's massive lobbying to keep pharma ads on TV. Let me make one point about that, kind of working for the pharma companies. And this is a counterintuitive, few people understand this. The point of pharma advertising is not to influence the customer. It's not to influence us watching the ridiculous ad. It's to influence the news itself. So pharma ads are 50% of TV news ads. They're the largest spender the revenue of mainstream media is paid for by pharma companies. And when you just think about logically, if either of us had an entity where 50% of our paycheck and our mortgage was paid for by one specific, very targeted entity that wanted specific things, that would impact what we say and what we do, most likely, even subconsciously. The reason that we had basically a metabolic disorder, COVID, only killing people that were metabolically unhealthy, exposing our disastrous immune systems and kind of metabolic fitness. Why did the media have no curiosity about that whatsoever? Why was the media only playing referee, eviscerating anyone who even questioned whether the pharmaceutical solution wasn't entirely the right and only way to go to cure this essentially metabolic condition? The media is not an investigatory arm anymore. They have no curiosity about why 33% of children are pre-diabetic or obesity rates are skyrocketing. They are literally, my friend, I guess I could call her a friend, a person I got to know, Jillian Michaels, recently went on CNN and she was being attacked as anti-science for saying Ozempic wasn't the cure for obesity, that food and exercise was. So that's who the media is right now. And that's what pharma is getting for their money.
Yeah, fair enough. Not surprising. Calley, unfortunately, we're running out of time.
Okay.
I really appreciate your insight and your perspective. If people want to find out a little bit more about what you do, your company, or find some stuff, 'cause I know you're on social media, where do they go?
Yeah, TrueMed.com is my company. You can get, again, doctor's notes for food and exercise if you qualify and use your HSA, FSA money, which are expiring soon, and you can reload for next year on healthy food and exercise at top brands. And I'm on the socials at Calley Means, CALLEYMEANS.
All right, man. Thanks a bunch. Appreciate it. Keep up the good work. For the rest of you guys, thanks for being here. Thanks, everybody. Take care, Calley. Bye-bye.